Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Steve Maceda again. This webinar is being recorded for posterity and the joy of our collaborators and our audience. Thank you again for joining us. We're very excited to talk with you today, and it gives me great pleasure to turn over this presentation to our wonderful Peggy Renahan, Elena Simmons, and our friend from the Department of Education, Mr. Michael DiPiero. Welcome, everyone. Peggy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it looks like we're having some technical issues, so I'll go ahead and begin until Peggy is able to join us again. And so you can access all materials online at the bit link here, http://bit.ly/FJCC-RRR. And this link will be provided to you throughout today's presentation, so you will have access to it. If you are currently unable to access it for one reason or another, please let us know, and you can always, of course, email me, and I will make sure that you do get access to this at the end of the presentation. All materials will be provided to you. So without further ado, let's begin. And again, as a reminder, if you missed something or wish to share this with someone, this is being recorded. So let's talk about who we are. Of course, you are familiar, I hope, with the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, partnership with the Frey Institute of Politics and Government here at UCF, and our wonderful friends at my alma mater, the UF, the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. And our webinar today is on how to actually review, remediate, and reteach for the EOC. We are joined today by our friend from the Florida Department of Education, Michael DiPiero, and by Elena Simmons from Bay County. And if you folks would just please say hello, we'll be very grateful.
Hello, everyone. This is Elena. Thanks for joining us this afternoon.
And this is Mike, and looking at this picture, I noticed my tie's crooked. And the funny part is, and I think this happens all the time, the picture here is the same picture shirt I'm wearing in my profile for my email. I need some new shirts. This is horrible. Is Peggy on?
Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, if you would please mute your microphones. Because we want to make sure that everyone can hear clearly. All right. It looks like Peggy is still in the process of getting on, but of course, as you know, Peggy Renahan is our regional program coordinator, who does a lot of great work, particularly up in the Panhandle, but elsewhere throughout the state as well.
Hi, Steve. I was able to get back connected. Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful. Sorry about that technology fail. Were both Michael and Elena introduced?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks. So we thought that we should probably start this conversation by talking about the difference between review, reteach, and remediate, knowing that there are three different things that a lot of times get lumped together as synonyms when in reality they're not. So when we're talking about review and what it means to review, the reality is that the adolescents we're dealing with don't remember what they learned from September. Be honest, they don't even remember to do their homework from last night. Therefore, the content that you taught them 7 months ago, they're certainly not going to remember either. So review is this concept of going back and revisiting and reminding students of the content from earlier in the year, giving that overview, hitting the big highlights, reminding them of the core concepts. So when you do that, a lot of times it's done whole class, it might be done with games, it might be done with activities. We have found success with if there's a way for you to incorporate and use manipulatives, that's a way to really appeal to all learners. There's some great activities out there that use some hands-on application versus Reteach. Right? Reteach, if you go to the next slide, Steve, hopefully I haven't lost my internet. Reteach is when the whole class just doesn't get it. We taught them about checks and balances or the 3 branches of government. We looked at C3.3 and we said, you know what, these students, they really nailed Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution. They got this for C3.3. And you assess them and lo and behold, they don't even know what you're talking about. And they're saying, yeah, I think there's some trees planted out back, but rather they don't really have a good feel for the 3 branches of government and what their function is. So for whatever reason, we have to go back and reteach because those concepts just were not demonstrated to mastery. What we know about when we reteach is that we have to do it in a different manner with a different approach and using alternative resources. And that's really critical because whatever we did the first time around didn't work, so we need to do it differently. Versus remediation. When we're looking at remediation, this is when we think about what are the needs of individual students or small groups of students, because those students didn't get those concepts related to that content. So we're going to identify some specific activities to help them. So for example, if student A missed benchmark C29, but student B missed benchmark C211, then each one of those students needs individual activities to help them with the mastery of those. Right. I'm seeing, Steve, in the chat box that people can't hear anything.
Looks like there's some issues with folks' local audio. I'm not sure why their volume is not working. I can hear you fine, and I think some other folks can as well. Yeah, it looks like it could be on the local end.
Great. Thank you guys for letting me know. I saw the messages and popping up, and I wanted to make sure that we didn't have another technology failure on this end, so I really appreciate it. So when we're looking at this remediation, you know, like I had said, was, you know, if student A didn't get 2.9 and student B didn't get 2.11, then those students need activities for 2.9 and 2.11. I don't need to do a whole group reteach of 2.9 and 2.11 because I had 2 students in class A and 3 students in class B who didn't get it. I need to find activities specifically for those students. Now, what may happen as I look at my data is that I figure out that I had several students in several classes all miss the same benchmark. And then that might drive my review, and it also might drive my reteaching. But as far as remediation goes, that's going to be really individualized for specific students. So someone's not muted, and I thought that I was in trouble, so I appreciate that. So Steve, if you'll go to the next slide, it has questions. And what we're going to do throughout this webinar is stop to be able to ask questions and, you know, see what, you know, those of you that are listening and watching are concerned about or need clarification about. So please pop those into the chat box at any time. We'll answer them as we're going along, but we'll also stop to answer them as well.
All group remediation activities.
One of the questions that I frequently get asked by teachers is, if I don't have, our district doesn't do any progress monitoring, how can I get this data that you're talking about? And so one of the things that we want to be able to share with you are some free resources for multiple response practice assessments that you can use to be able to harvest data that's also mimicking the end of course assessment environment and what those students are going to experience with those types of questions. So the first one It's from the Florida Virtual School. They have a practice test available. This practice test is 56 questions. One of the things that you want to note about it is that number 8 is blank on the practice test. So as you're going through, just sort of keep that in mind. There is an answer key available, and on the answer key in red, it provides a rationale for the correct response. So if you're wondering why A is the correct response, it provides an answer for you. Another resource that's also been loaded in the drive for you comes from the Civics test item specifications. So that practice test is a 35 question practice test. And the reason it's 35 questions is because there's 35 directly assessed benchmarks. And in the Civics test item specifications, there are 35 sample items. What we've done is we've pulled out each one of those 35 sampled items and compiled them into what looks like a very official formal test. Then there's an answer key for it, and there's student response sheets available. All of these are loaded in the drive for you, so all you'd have to do is print them or load them into if you have some kind of service that you could do that with. A new resource that has just come available is from Civics 360 website, and this is an end-of-year practice test, and this is going to be an online assessment. There are 60 questions in this assessment, and the items are scrambled every time the students take it. One of the things that's critical, though, is the student performance report is standardized, so that'll be the same. So regardless of the order in which the questions appear while your students are taking this, the report is standardized so that you can compare apples to apples to apples. It will show up when we look at it as question 1 was, the information for question 1 is the same across the board. What we ask is that you not post these resources on any other website. When you go into the Google Drive, there's a PDF version of the 60 question test. So we really thought that that was important for professional educators to be able to have access to what are the questions, in what format are they being asked, what's their cognitive complexity, as well as what's their benchmark alignment. But what we ask for you to do is don't post that test on any of your websites. If you want students to experience the assessment, please send them to the Civics 360. One of the things that we know is the greatest benefit that students can experience is having that online testing environment that so oftentimes they're missing. So Civics 360 doesn't have all the feature functionality as tests have 8 or 9, similar to what you're going to see on the EPAT, but what it will do is build that test longevity. It's 60 questions. You're probably not going to be able to get through it the entire class period, but what will happen is wherever students stop, they can pick up where they left off. It'll ask you, do you want to resume where you last left in the test? When you go to the Google Drive, you're going to see a blueprint for the assessment as well as an item analysis tool. The item analysis tool is amazing because not only does it have the benchmark, the cognitive complexity, it also has the type of stimulus, or if it has a stimulus attached to it. So I see some questions are coming in about the reports. So when we go to Civics 360, which Civics 360 is the new Florida Joint Center for Citizenship website in partnership with Escambia County Schools. It is funded by the Lou Frey Institute, but the whole website is designed to target civic knowledge and skills for the civics end of course assessment. And it is a website that's supposed to be used by students, parents, and teachers. And so we've tried to provide a flexible approach to instruction, review, and now assessment. So I'm going to go ahead and show you some screenshots of what it would look like when you take the Florida Civics practice test. You see there's a spot where you can enter your name, and I put in student sample, so that's why it says welcome student in the picture on the right hand side. And it gives you a little bit of information about this practice test, can let you know if you're on the right track, right? It's modeled after the end of course assessment. And you can, see, okay, well, how do I navigate this? But then you can go ahead and start the test as well. Once you start the test, you're going to be guided through 60 questions. At the end of that 60 questions, and there are 60 questions, if those of you that are familiar with the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship assessment items, they are pulled from them, so they are modeled after the OCA items, so they're going to really simulate that environment for them. You can say, yeah, that's my first time I took this test, or second, third, fourth, or fifth, and then it's going to produce a report for you. There's going to be a summary generator. and they'll click that blue button that says Generate Test Results Document, and a new window with a PDF is going to show up. So this particular sample student got an 85%. They got 51 out of 60 correct answers. And it's great to know an overall score, but what we really want to know for the purposes of driving our remediation is what did the students do, how did they do on the different benchmarks. So there's a 2-page report that is produced. This is page 1, and you're going to see at the top of it, it's going to have the student's name, when they took it, and when they self-identified how many attempts. Then there's the score. So as you saw before, I got 51 out of 60 correct. I got 85% on this test. And I did that intentionally because I wanted you to be able to look to see how it combined the items for the benchmarks. So this page gives you the possible correct. And we see that for C11, there were 2 questions to which I got 0 correct out of those 2 questions. So for the purposes of remediation, I think C11 is probably a benchmark I need to go back and look at. Right? Versus if you scroll down to the end of the image and you look at C312, there were 3 questions about the Supreme Court cases, and I got all 3 of those right. So that's a strong suit for me. So this particular page combines the data so that you can see how they did. The second page of the report gives you, though, each of the individual items, and if that item was correct, and as well as its cognitive complexity. So it's got the benchmark code, the benchmark QID, and then the result, correct or incorrect, and then the cognitive complexity. Because one of the things that you might be able to look at, and that I believe Michael is going to share with us today, is your student may have a mastery of the content, but it's those thinking skills, it's the critical thinking, it's the cognitive complexity that really is the downfall. You know, are there any patterns? Were they really messing up with the highs? Or was it a combination of both content and skills? So we provided this report to be able to give you some additional data to analyze, and hopefully that cognitive complexity as well as the benchmark identifier will come in handy for you. So I'm going to go ahead and pause now to see if there's any questions in the chat box that haven't been answered. Okay, I see what suggestions do you have for small group remediation activities. In about, I'm going to say 10 slides, we're going to give you a lot of suggestions for small group remediation activities. And do the students have to have an account, and are the reports printable and customizable? So one of the things that's really important to note is have the students save their report and or go ahead and print that report. Because once you close the page that it's on, you're not going to be able to regenerate that data. And so once you save it, though, it's saved. And as far as customizing, not at this point, it just generates that PDF that you saw with the page 1 and the page 2. Yes, well, no. So Farron asked, does a teacher have access to the 360 reports for each of the students? And not at this time is the answer to that, Farron. So what we ask that you do is you have your teachers save, or your students rather, save their report and or print their report, or go ahead and participate in the next activity that we're going to look at with it up on the screen using that data.
Get your teacher account, you go in, you like the practice test, I'll take it, send you a PDF or something of it, and put it in grade camp so we don't have to mess around with any of the reports here. That'd be awesome. You guys are just old questions, so has anyone gone into it yet? No. Are they old questions?
Okay, so I think I just heard Rachel saying that it could be loaded up into GradeCam, and then if you load it up into GradeCam, then you would be able to analyze your data a little differently and do something with that there. And the question was, I'm sorry?
Yeah, we were having a discussion. I apologize. I'm sorry. I thought we were on mute.
No, you're okay, because that's a really great idea. If you don't have access to using them on computers and practicing that online environment, that was one of the reasons that we wanted to provide the 60-question test for you, was so that you might get creative and do something like that, which opens you up to a large variety of other data assessment opportunities. The questions are questions from the FJCC Teacher Item Bank, as well as the ones from the item specifications. the new one, there are new items as well as previously existing items. Awesome. So now we have all of this great and amazing data. Maybe we've used an alternative source to be able to harvest it. Maybe we're using that printout report. And a lot of this, what we're getting ready to talk about right now, can be done with your progress monitoring that maybe your district already has. But if your district doesn't already have a progress monitoring tool, maybe you could use the Civics 360 instead. And so I want to introduce Elena Simmons from Bay District Schools to guide us through how we can empower our students to develop their own action plans for individualized remediation.
Thank you, Peggy. I do just kind of want to explain kind of my role in my district. I am the instructional specialist for Bay District Schools, and I spend a lot of my time in classrooms working with civics teachers, helping them plan, helping them develop action plans, and working with students. So just to kind of let you know where I'm coming from with this, a lot of times when I work with teachers, they really struggle with students taking ownership and students taking responsibility for reviewing. So we wanted to be able to provide you with a tool to use in conjunction with that Civics 360 report. So the student data analysis sheet, which you're seeing on your screen right now, kind of allows students to take ownership of their learning by determining what are their biggest weaknesses. So using that report that Peggy presented earlier, whether you have printed it or they're looking at it on a PDF in the screen, they are going to look at it and analyze their results to determine which benchmarks they individually need to review. So in part 1, students are going to be able to use this activity sheet to identify their 5 lowest benchmarks and their 3 highest benchmarks based on their results. And we kind of gave them an example there, you know, 2 out of 2, 3 out of 3 means that you did well on that benchmark. If you got 0 out of 2, that's going to be your lowest. And some of them may have more than 5, but we just want them to try and focus on at least their lowest 5 that they really need to work on. We have them.
Hold on, Elena. Steve, can you go to the next slide, please?
Yeah, so in part 1, they're identifying the highest 3 and the lowest 5. And then in part 2, we're going to give them a moment to celebrate their success. Be excited about those top 3 benchmarks that you did really, really well on. On the next slide, in part 3, is where we're going to allow them to do some activities to really review those lowest 5 benchmarks. Students can use Civics 360 to go back to that specific benchmark, and then in one column we want them to just jot down the benchmark language so they know exactly what they're going to be reviewing. Then in the next column we've given them some options about different review activities that they can do. And these are based all from the Civics 360 site. So we're asking them to choose at least 3 and to provide evidence that they've completed those review activities. So by giving them multiple options, it gives students some voice and choice in their learning while still providing them with a really specific and guided review. Doesn't really matter which 3 they choose because they're all going to be high quality resources that reviews the content that they need based on that assessment. In that last column, we're also just giving them a summary spot to kind of jot down their biggest takeaways from their review resources, just an opportunity for them to synthesize and reflect on what they learned during those 3 review resources. Teachers can also use the sheet. I forgot to mention that if you don't have access to GradeCam and you might not have access to your student reports, you can just look at that part 1 where students have jotted down their lowest 5 and you can identify some class-wide trends just from that part of the student analysis sheet. Are there any questions about that student-generated analysis sheet and having students take ownership of that review? Okay, then we've kind of looked at a way for students individually to plan and to make an action plan. Michael's going to share with you kind of how to look at your whole class or your whole course data and to make some adjustments.
Thank you, Elena. Before I move on through this section, Peggy, did you want to add anything linking the two sections or fill anything in before I move on?
Thanks, Michael, and thank you, Elena. That was fabulous, because one of the things that we know is that when students take responsibility for what they didn't get, that's the most empowering. So we started this webinar off talking about reviewing and going over everything and recognizing when we needed to reteach, because clearly we had some kind of miscommunication, so we needed to go back and do a broadband. But when it comes to remediation, that means I individually didn't get something and I individually need to go and learn more about that. And so that's really empowering those students to be able to figure that out for themselves and then choose which ones are the resources that they want to work with in order to be able to do that. But we're also basing a lot of this on the premise that we're using a valid and reliable assessment, and we, as the professional educator, trust in that resource. And sometimes when the data comes back, as we alluded to earlier, it might be a content issue or it might be a skills issue. And that was one of the reasons why we really felt it was important to provide the 60-question test for the professional educator, not necessarily for the students, but for you all to be able to really look closely at the information and do some data analysis and some that really digging in deep into what you think students may or may not know, be able to do. And that's what Michael's going to really explore with us today, is how do we do that? Because that's a pretty tall task. It's one thing to have students say, I'm weak in this benchmark and I need to go use this resource. It's another thing as professional educators to say, I'm going to look closely at my data and see if I can determine any trends. So Michael, would you help us figure out how to do that, please?
I'll do my best. You set me up pretty well, Peg. I appreciate that. So if you would mind going back one slide. With this introduction, and give me 1 second here to provide a little context similar to Elena, because I really liked how she did that to show where she was coming from. And I had a similar role within Broward County Schools that Elena has with Bay Schools. And when we were planning this webinar, I thought, what did we do so much with our new teachers? And what we're about to go through is a lot of what we did with new teachers. We focused heavily on data-driven instruction, and this is a piece of it. We look at qualitative methods, so looking at student writing samples, which we're not going to do through this presentation. We're going to focus on the Civics 360 assessment. So as we go through this, we're going to use a tool to analyze student performance, specifically on the Civics 360 assessment for our sample data. The process of analyzing student work helps teachers make sense of the student data, which allows us to tailor the instruction to meet student needs, which is exactly what we were trying to do when we were working with new teachers. Working with veteran teachers as well is something we want to do, but we really had those rich opportunities and structured time to do so with the new teachers. So through this section, we're going to develop some criteria and a structure to analyze the student performance. We're going to look at some class trends from the sample data that we're using, and we're going to learn how to use some of this data and hopefully go back and address that Osceola question a little bit more and add to what Elena said about providing maybe some small group remediation based on this. So as we go through this section, keep an open mind. It is very dense, as Peggy said, but as we go through this section, also be thinking about how some of the data that we're pulling will help in reteaching and with remediation. All right, let's move on from here. When we're working with multiple select items, or when we're working with essay questions for that matter, you're going to have to determine what your cutoff is going to be like for your incorrect answers. In other words, you're going to have to describe your expectations, whether it's describing your expectations for a writing assignment or describing your expectations for what students should be answering correctly on these assessments. This may be done as an individual, a team, a school, a district. I know some schools said if teachers or students were getting 70% correct on one item, then you can move forward. If students are getting less than 70%, that's an opportunity to either reteach or remediate as needed. For this, we're going to base this on 22 students in a class, and we're going to examine items with 10 or more incorrect student answers. which means 45% of the class answered that question incorrectly. I don't know how that translates over to your districts. Your districts, you may say 60% of students or 70% of students have to answer it incorrectly to come in on this phase. So it's really a district decision, but I based it off of the test item specifications. Page 7, it gives you this item difficulty rating here. And if we use the criteria that I established with 10 or more incorrect student answers, we'll really be looking at students who got average questions incorrect and challenging questions incorrect. And you know, one more thing with this before I move on. Peggy mentioned something in the beginning, and she said the students who just do not get it. When you're in this phase of describing your expectations or describing what you want for each test item to be correct, I mean, obviously we all want 100%, but realistically we're going to have to come up with a number that we're going to work with. When we're making that determination, this is where you have to have Peggy's words coming into your head saying, what does it mean not to get it on this benchmark? All right, Steve? There are many considerations when determining what student work to analyze. As shown on the screen here, you can consider certain subgroups, or you could consider looking at the whole class. As I stated, for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on the whole class because the principles of looking at a whole class versus the principles of looking at a subgroup are going to be relatively the same. The only difference is with the subgroup, you may be determining what students you're going to look at based on these were your lowest performers. These are some students that have been struggling all year but did well on the test, or did well all year and struggled on the test. So it's really going to be what you want to glean from this data and what you want to really focus on. Okay, next slide. This is the data analysis tool blank. The data analysis tool can be used for any multiple select items. So whether you're using the Civics 360 or the Florida Virtual Assessment or something created in the school, the structure of the tool is the same. What changes is the information that you plug into the tool based on your assessment. But when analyzing data, it's helpful to use a tool because a tool provides a structure and objective analysis of student performance. One of the key things here is that objective analysis, because sometimes we have this idea looking at a question or looking at questions or looking at overall student performance to automatically draw a conclusion about why the data looks the way it does. But having the tool and a process allows you to remove that jump to conclusion and go through the process to see if there's anything else and dig a little bit deeper. Again, shown is the template that we're going to use today. This portion of the presentation will use the Civics 360 assessment. Keep in mind that the Civics 360 assessment is 60 questions. Therefore, you may want to consider some ways to keep the data more manageable. In other words, you may want to just look at a subgroup of your students when doing this, or you may want to actually just use what Elena's tool does and say, let's just actually examine each student's data of their lowest 5 questions, because now you're starting to target a little bit more. And how I used to do this with my teachers when we would do this working in the classroom, a quick way is just to have students self-report. I don't know what the policy in your class is or your school, so that's really going to be up to you. But for question 1, you just say, if you got question 1 wrong, raise your hand, tally the number, move on to question 2, question 3. And I also like to get the common incorrect answer because that adds a little bit more richness to the data. So just think about ways you could actually collect this data that's going to be the most efficient for you, because we don't want the collection of the data to be prohibitive of the actual analysis. And the second piece to that is this works well with just a 10 or 15 question assessment as long as they're valid and reliable. So I don't want you to think that you have to use this only for a 60 question assessment. Use it to your advantage however you see fit. All right, next question.
Michael, if I could interrupt you real quick. I apologize. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please mute your phones or your microphones because we're getting some background noise. It's making it a bit difficult to hear. Thank you very much. Apologize.
Wow, I thought, no, just kidding. Like the background noise coming from me. We're having a huge party at the Department of Education celebrating my Civics webinar here with y'all, but that's not happening. It's no background noise from me. Anyway, on the screen here, this is what the document looks like with the data plugged in. Everything in just the plain black text relates to the Civics 360 examination, and you are provided with this document for all 60 questions. All you would have to do would be input the student information that you want based on the student score reports. Once data is entered into this document, we want to look for patterns, and that's what the focus of these slides are going to be. Remember, we decided to use whole class for this. Looking at patterns, we're going to look at patterns in the incorrect answers, the number of students who answered incorrectly, and patterns in common incorrect answers. This could provide us a lot of information that's going to be able to drive our effort to fill our student knowledge gaps. Remember that we're starting by looking at class level data, therefore we're getting a snapshot across trends in the class. Keep in mind though, you could do this if you have multiple civics classes, you could see the trends across your classes because you may be delivering the same lesson to each of your classes, but your students may be responding to the lesson differently. And that may be factors related to, is the class after lunch, reading levels of some of the students, or the students may be responding the same. And this works well if you have common formative assessments in the school with 2 or 3 civics teachers giving the same assessment. You can look for patterns across the different teachers as well, which really helps you collaborate. And I know there's schools out there with only 1 civics teacher, and it would be nice and ideal if you could then maybe collaborate with a teacher at another school. Who knows? Just some ideas. Anyway, looking at the common incorrect answer column, you'll notice where it says NA. What that means is students' answers were evenly distributed across incorrect answer choices. But if you look at a question like number 4, where it has letter C and the 8 next to it, that means of the 12 incorrect answer choices, 8 of the students selected letter C, which could lead to maybe there's a misconception on that one, rather than just it was evenly distributed, which could have been just a guess. Anyway, we're going to take a closer look at this in the next couple slides. So let's go into the first one here. The first thing we're going to look at is patterns in incorrect answers. When looking at patterns, we want to maintain an inquiry stance by suspending our judgment and just focusing on the facts. I know I already mentioned that, but so often we could forget that. So when we're looking at data, we just want to be as objective as possible. Think about the patterns that emerge when we look at the questions with 10 or more incorrect answers. So question 2, question 4, question 7, question 11, question 12. Remember our criteria was 10 or more incorrect answers. You probably noticed some patterns. I noticed some patterns as well when I was going through this, and the major pattern that I noticed here was 5 items, all 5 items that are circled in red. So all 5 items with 10 or more incorrect answers included a primary text as stimulus. And this goes back to what Peggy was saying. Is it a skills deficiency, or is it a knowledge deficiency, or is it a combination thereof? Also notice that students performed within the acceptable range on 2 questions that had the primary text stimulus. Remember, we want to just remain objective here. So what we'd want to do is look at those questions and see what the stimulus is to see if there's any reason that they struggled with those 5, but they were able to get 2 of the other ones. So rather than just declare students struggle with primary text, we should take a look at the primary text, and we're going to do that on this slide. The stimulus on the left are what the students got correct, and on the right are what they got incorrect. So when looking at each category of text, consider how familiar the students are with the text. For example, what we noticed was students answered the questions based on the preamble and the Declaration of Independence correctly. So from the left, the students answered questions correctly, but they were based on documents that they were probably a little bit more familiar with. The documents that the students answered incorrectly were the Virginia Declaration of Rights, Common Sense, the Second Treatise of Government, and the Federalist Papers. I believe there's 2 from the Federalist Papers. Now, keep this in mind. This isn't supposed to be discouraging. It's not to say students will only get the questions correct if they've seen the documents before. What this means is, and what this really shows is, students are not going to be able to see every document. We're not going to be able to expose students to every document before the end of course assessment. So what we need to figure out is start having a discussion about, did the students get these 2 questions right because they are familiar with the documents? Did the students struggle with the other documents because of the language in the documents? Now, the language in both sets of documents could be equally as complex, but the difference is they've practiced with the other documents before. Now, we're not going to do this together, but in our data analysis, the conversation then emerges, what opportunities do your students have to interact with complex texts? And the other piece of that is, what strategies do you do for them and with them when they're interacting with complex texts? So are you modeling? Is there any metacognitive strategies? Are you using something like AP parts? So do students have a process for tackling these texts? Based on this information here, I would probably jump to, go back real quick. Lost you, Steve. Based on this information provided right here, I would probably go back to my original conclusion, which is supported now by this, that students are struggling with complex texts. And I think this is reflected in the data that I presented, and this may be the reality for a lot of you out there. So the next question becomes, whether you're remediating in small group or you're doing whole group instruction, how do you get students to interact with these texts? Granted, this is the time of year we're at, granted the student's reading level, and how often you've already been doing this. So that's just one conversation to have from this. Okay, next slide. I still want to look at the number of incorrect answers, but now let's take a little look at the standards and what this shows about the standards. Because on Elena's document, she was talking about what are your bottom standards here. So when we're looking at this document, we'll notice that question 1 and 2, which relates to C1 and C1, a student got it right and wrong. Same for 1.2 and same for 1.4. Students answered both of them incorrect for 1.7. This is now up to the teacher to say, do I go back and look at 1.1 and see if students need additional help with that? Or do I just focus on the questions where students got both the questions or all of the questions wrong? And I think what Elena's remediation document is alluding to is she's focusing on the worst. So if you're 0 for 3, if you're 0 for 2, you're probably focusing on those questions. There's so much in education that comes down to the teacher's judgment to make the best decision for her students or his students. So in this case, if I was doing this with one of the teachers I was working with, there's some options to look at moving forward, which I selected an option, but I would present these options. And I would say, option 1, let's compare each item for which students scored both within and below the acceptable range to further determine if there's a skills, content, or gap in both. So that would be one option. Let's look at question 1 and 2. Let's look at question 3 and 4. And I'll go a little bit faster with this. I apologize. It's just so deep with this. And then I would say let's look at the item specification for 1.7 because I think that's where the time's going to be best spent right now. So let's go to the next slide, Steve. So when we're in item 1.7, here's a huge thing we need to do. We know what the benchmark is. What are the benchmark clarifications? And this is a good point for the teacher to reflect and look back and go, when I taught 1.7, did I hit clarification 1, 2, 3, or 4 there? 3 of the 4 clarifications mentioned checks and balances, and both questions that the students got wrong on this involved checks and balances. And we could go into greater depth on this at a little bit later of a time, but I just wanted to show you how the questions should be able to match up to the clarifications. And so should your instruction. Good, Steve, I'll go through this. This is looking for questions or patterns in common incorrect answers. So if you click on, I don't think there's one to click on here. But when we're looking at questions and we're looking at patterns on patterns for incorrect answers, when you see something like question 2 and it's evenly distributed, chances are the students may have guessed, because if there's not a pattern in the answer, they may just not have the knowledge or the skills to get it right now. So I would ask the students and have that conversation to see if they guessed and walk through that. When you see a question like number 4 and number 11, when you see so many students answering the incorrect answer the same, it might just be a misconception. So let's go to the next slide and see what I mean by that. And you could click on it because, yep. So displayed on the screen are the answer choices from aforementioned 4 and 11. Keep in mind that the misconception could just be based on faulty thinking or faulty understanding rather than just a guess. So a misconception means that the students understand the content, but their logic for answering it may have been off. And when we're looking at this and we're analyzing this, is it a possible misconception that students confuse checks and balances and separation of powers? And is it a possible misconception that they confuse elected versus appointed? I think those are logical misconceptions, but the reason this is important is because when you're planning to remediate or reteach or anything, you're planning your next steps. If it's a misconception, it's going to look different than if it's a if it's just straight wrong. All right, next slide. This slide just shows the data that we gleaned from this analysis, because I spoke through it slowly, then I spoke through it quickly, so I apologize for the pace on that. But if you come back and look at the slides from this, look at this data, and maybe this could be a question you could have within your group. How can this information inform your review and remediation? You could flip. And then here's some points to consider when looking at the data. Because so often we could get all of this rich information, but what happens next with it is really going to be at the discretion of the teacher and what resources are at their disposal and what they feel will be best for the students. So I'm just going to leave these here without talking through them and give you the opportunity, if you have any questions, to contact me about them or maybe discuss these within your schools. I think I have one more here. And then this is just determining individual student needs. It's the same process, looking at trends across the incorrect answers and looking at trends across what students got incorrect. And determining the individual student needs is actually just taking a deeper dive at some of your subgroups in order to figure those trends out for those needs. How did I do, Steve?
That was fabulous, Michael.
Okay, I apologize. I'm so used to going slow through some of this. So if anybody has any additional questions with it, please contact me. This is not, you know, it's not, I don't get it the first time, let's forget about it. It's, if you have any questions, I'm so happy to help clarify and work with you through it. And I know Peggy would be too.
Well, thank you, Michael. We really appreciate your help in analyzing that data and breaking down what really are some complex concepts and digging deep into that data. But we have to do that digging deep in order to reveal some of those trends that you talked about, is when we're able to see that, oh, it's primary source documents that my students are struggling with, but specifically it's my ELL students that are struggling with those primary source documents. What are the strategies that I need to employ for them? Or it's, oh, this is just a text-heavy question, and my struggling readers are the subgroup that are struggling with this. Or maybe it's a political cartoon, and all my students across the levels, regardless of their abilities, had an issue with it. And so I think digging deep into that is what really helps us to figure out what we need to do in order to meet the needs of our students. And we need the appropriate resources to be able to meet their needs, whether we're talking about struggling students, struggling readers, ELL, ESS, or ESE students, or our level 5 students that are struggling with a particularly complex concept, because we won't want to forget about them either. So I'd ask Elena if she would please go ahead and share some resources that she has found helpful in her district to use with her teachers.
Thank you, Peggy. So I love all of those tools that Michael shared, and it's really, you know, once you've used those different tools and you've identified, you know, the specific weaknesses that you're going to work on, because like Michael said, you're going to have options and you just have to use teacher's discretion to determine, okay, what benchmark is going to be the biggest bang for my buck, what resources really jam up that's going to drive my review. Just remember, like Peggy mentioned earlier, it's important that you use new and different materials and activities to expose students to the content. So we're giving them the content and or the skills in a new and meaningful way during that review. So I'm going to share with you just a few research-based effective resources for reteaching and review. The first one is what Peggy had shared with you earlier, Civics 360. I know that a lot of you may already be using this resources, and I saw in the chat box that some people were logging in and playing around. I'm just going to kind of give you a step-by-step overview of some of the different features that it has. I presented this to my teachers probably about 2 months ago, and they've been using it heavily the last month or so, so I'll kind of share with you some of the ways that my teachers have been using it in their classrooms and ways that they have found success with it. Once you create an account and log in, which is a very easy process, you will come to a Let's Explore page and click on they're divided in different units. So I'm just going to show you one unit as an example. We're going to look at the legal system, and we're going to look at a specific benchmark, C311. So if I use those tools that Michael was sharing and I identify that, wow, my students really had an issue with state and federal courts, then I'm going to select this benchmark and look at the different options that are available on 360. So once you click on the benchmark, it's going to take you to a benchmark landing page. And on this landing page, it's going to have, it's going to list the benchmarks, and then you're going to look at the various resources that are available. Your first option there is the downloadable module guide, which basically combines the video and the reading guides all into one resource. So if you know, wow, we're going to have to really do a comprehensive review or reteach of this benchmark, then the module guide might be the tool for you because it has everything together in one place. The next slide shows that it's available in Word. So once you download it, you can modify it, change questions, delete columns, add tasks, or add questions to, make it work for your students. And there's also a copy in the Google Drive if you want to look at an example. The next wonderful piece of this is the video resources for the benchmark. Depending on the benchmark, there may be one video or multiple videos, just depending on the content. And each video has a viewing guide. So if there's 3 videos, there's 3 separate viewing guides. I will tell you that my teachers have really been loving this. I had a call from one of my teachers who teaches all ESE students, and he was so excited because he said for the first time all year his students were really engaged with the content and they were excited about learning. So definitely really student-friendly, great resources that get students engaged in the content. And yes, Steve, not all benchmarks currently have a video. Some of them are still in development. So whenever you are determining what resources you're going to use, just click on the benchmark to make sure that the video is available because some of them are still in the development phase.
Thank you. I'm too young for a stroke.
In addition to the video resources, there are also readings. These are similar to the readings that are available on the Escambia site. So each benchmark has a reading for every single benchmark clarification, and the readings are available in English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole, and each reading also has a viewing guide. Or I guess viewing guide reading guide would be a better word to use for it, but it's a guide that gives some text-dependent questions based on the reading that are at varying levels of difficulty and complexity. So it's some guiding questions to guide students through those readings, and you have it there, especially in the primary languages that we have in the state of Florida. So if you have those ELL students that Spanish or Haitian Creole is their native language, that'll definitely be a great tool to help you review with them. In addition to the readings, there are also some other helpful resources. My favorite ones are these vocabulary support resources. There are those traditional Quizlet vocabulary games that allow students to just practice simple recall of the terms, but there's also the additional concept circles vocabulary tools. And these concept circles, they basically just support vocabulary usage and help students demonstrate comprehension of the terms. It allows you to assess student understanding of big concepts in context. So like the example here, it's asking them to explain connections between and among each of the terms in the concept circle. So they're assessing their understanding of a big idea by using all four of those terms. So it's a really higher level, you know, not just can they spout off the definition, do they really understand the relationship between all these terms. So it's a great tool to really assess student understanding there. Another great tool that my teachers have really enjoyed are these 3-question quizzes that give feedback for each item. The 3-question quiz allows, can everyone hear me? Can you hear me now? Someone,
yes.
I see someone, okay, just making sure. The 3-question quiz is practice, it's EOC style formatted questions. And my favorite feature is that if a student gets the wrong answer, it gives them feedback in student-friendly language, and it gives them like some specific feedback about what they need to go back and review and look at. So it's not just, hey, you got this wrong, start over. It gives them some specific feedback. There's also a reflection piece in the module guide that allows them to do some reflection after they've taken the quiz. You know, what did I learn? What do I need to go back and review? So Civics 360 is a really good jumping off point because of the different resources that they have. Even if the video isn't yet available for that benchmark, the readings and the reading guides along with the vocabulary practice is a really good solid starting point for you to drive your review. This next tool that you're looking at is available for you in the Google Drive, and it's something that I created for my teachers and that they have really enjoyed utilizing. It aligns text from various places to civics benchmarks, and in the blue is just hyperlinked straight to the test item spec page, but in the red it will link you directly to a text. All of the texts are lexiled in the 6-8 grade band, but some of them are available in lower lexiles, which we'll take a look at, which will help you do some differentiation. But in each one of the texts in the document, I pulled out the civics content focus terms from the test item specs that show up in that document. So it's something that you can definitely use in your classroom as you pull small groups, but you can also collaborate with your ELA teacher and use. Really quickly, an example of one of these, this is from CommonLit. This resource, CommonLit provides free instructional materials to support literacy development, and they have text in grades 5 through 12, so you can definitely differentiate there. If you look at the next slide, in addition to the text, they also provide secondary texts that are paired with this one. They have related media, which are video clips typically. There's a teacher's guide, and then there's also a parent guide. So if you have parents that really want to give an extra layer of support at home, there's a parent guide that you can send home with them. Each article you can put in guided reading mode there, and students, it grays out text after each question, so it really helps with your struggling readers and helps them to go back and to reread in the text. It also is really good for ESE students, and it gives you, if you have ELL students, it has the ability to translate the text into 13 different languages, and it translates in a pop-out window so students can see the English text and then the translated text on top of it, which is a really good strategy to help ELL students. If you're not a tech person, it's commonlit.org, but all of the text in the Google Drive, once you get to the document, are automatically linked, so you just have to click on the red link, Kim, and it will take you directly there. And you just have to create a free account, but it's for free. But if you're having issues accessing it, you can just email me too, and I can help you out. The next example that a lot of the resources come from is from Newsela. It's also a free account, and they're linked directly. If you look at the snip from the document, the red is where the documents are hyperlinked, so if you'll just click there, it'll take you directly to Newsela and to the website. But Newsela has a clearinghouse of high-interest news and nonfiction articles. They release new ones daily, and they release them at 5 levels of complexity from grades 2 through 12. So if you really have those struggling readers or those ESE students who are far below grade level, it gives them an exposure to the content on their grade level that's still aligned and appropriate. They also have Spanish translations. So if you have those, so there's the different lexiles that it's available. And then there's also the Spanish translation. If you have ELL students that Spanish is their native language, you can use it with them. And then really quickly, the last resource I'm going to share with you is also linked on Civics 360. And I know a lot of you are already using this. These are the floridastudents.org tutorials. And in the, when you're on Civics 360, in the helpful resources section that we looked at earlier that had the vocabulary piece, all of these are aligned and linked. These are tutorial videos that guide students through understanding of the content. They provide interactive videos in checking for understanding questions for students to complete as they go through the tutorial. One thing I did want to mention, when you go to floridastudents.org, I recommend only utilizing the Florida resources because those are the only ones that are specifically aligned to the civics benchmarks on the end of course assessment. The additional resources down there, not that those aren't good, but they're sometimes the alignment is questionable. So your best go-to resource is going to be those that are Florida aligned and then are already linked on Civics 360. They also have a nice piece if you have students with, you know, a disability that they need to have something in front of them while they're watching the video. On the next slide, once you click on the video and scroll down, there's an attachment and it has the whole video PDF'd. So that's another piece that you can use with struggling students. But I know that we're out of time. Does anyone have any questions about any of those resources? Like I said, CommonLit and Newsela is a free account, so once you link to those resources, you'll just have to create a free account. That's all from me, Peggy and Steve.
Right, right. Well, thank you both, Elena and Michael. We appreciate learning from your experiences as well as getting your advice. I just typed my email address in the chat box in case anybody wanted to email me directly, and Elena's typed hers in. Michael, if you'll do the same, and Steve, if you'll do the same when you get a chance, then you all will be able to access our email to go ahead and contact us. So in this webinar, what we attempted to try to provide you with was a variety of multiple choice assessments that you could use for obtaining data, and then some options for evaluating that data, options for having students evaluate their data, and then some resources to utilize when you are deciding what to do for your review, your reteaching, or your individualized remediation. What's going to happen next is you and your students are going to participate in the administration of the Civics End of Course Assessment. So our next webinar will be all about understanding the Civics End of Course Assessment data. So we don't have a date set for that yet because the data will be released at some point in early June 2017, at which time we will begin analyzing that data and compile the webinar for you. So if you will, please be on the lookout for an email advertising that for sometime in June 2017, the Understanding the Civics End of Course Assessment data. We really appreciate your participation. This webinar will be available online by next Monday. Please feel free to reach out to Elena, Michael, myself, or Steve. We are here to help you. A lot of questions that were submitted in advance of this webinar were answered in webinar 1. So if you feel like you don't have any questions, some of your questions were left unanswered, if you'll please take a moment and go back and review that. You might find it really helpful. So we thank you again. The recording will stop now, but we'll remain on the line for any additional questions. Thank you. Well, thank you. We're really glad that coming in the chat box that some people are really excited about the new tools and helping students individualize their needs. So we're really excited to be able to help you. We are a responsive organization and try to do everything that we can based on meeting your needs as the professional educators that are out there. So hence the student-friendly readings being done in Haitian Creole as well as Spanish. We heard you loud and clear that you needed some additional resources to be able to provide scaffolded supports for your ELLs. The recording for this webinar will be available by Monday. And Steve, it'll be posted on the blog, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful. So Jessica's asking, how do I access the Google Drive in the blog? So Steve, if you repost the link to the Google Drive, there's a, here we go, I've got it posted. So here's the bit.ly. So everything for the webinar, for those of you who joined us late, everything for the webinar is available at that bit.ly link in the Google Drive. And you'll be able to access those resources there. And then Steve, how can they begin to follow your blog?
Pull it up for you and show you. It's also updated on our main website, so there's overlap. Our blog is floridaCitizens.wordpress.com. We also have, as you can see, this is the last webinar. We also have a Twitter feed that we encourage you to follow at FL_citizen, where we also update and provide resources. And of course, we also have our Facebook page and resources there as well.
So floridacitizen.wordpress.com is where your blog is.
Yes, and we also have it on our main page. All you have to do is click on blog, and the same post you'll find there as well.
Wonderful. And Steve posted earlier in the chat, if you experience, we're currently working through a glitch with the Civics 360 site. So if you have any issues with Civics 360, please try first using Control-Shift-R to reboot your browser. That seems to be resolving some of the issues that people are experiencing. We're aware of it and working through it and hope to have it resolved within the next couple of days. And if you have any issues getting into the Google Drive using the bit.ly link, just email me at Peggy, Peggy.Renihan, Renihan @ucf.edu, and I will send you the link directly.